Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webcast on the MUI Rule changes. My name is Connie McLaughlin, and I work in the MUI office here at the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities. Now I'm going to turn over to Scott Phillips, our Deputy Director of the MUI unit.
Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being in attendance today. I know how busy everybody is these days, and with holidays coming up, but very much appreciate you taking time out to allow us to talk to you about the revisions to the MUI rule. Before we get into the detail of the information, I want to take a minute to introduce the folks that are here participating on the webcast today. I'm Scott Phillips, the MUI unit director here with the department. And also we have
I'm Jeff Davis, president of Opera.
And Chuck Davis, I'm the MUI manager of Franklin County.
And we asked folks, these folks to join us today just because we wanted to have them give some feedback about the process and kind of talk with us at various stages throughout the training today to talk about different steps. And I think the primary reason we wanted them to participate today was we had this time around an amazing group of stakeholders to talk about this rule, to try to improve this rule, to try to make sure that we move forward in a positive direction to protect Ohioans with developmental disabilities. And both Jeff and Chuck and many of the other stakeholders just did a tremendous job of representing their folks and making sure that the issues that need to be addressed were addressed. And I'm not sure how many of you have been a part of a rule review process before, but sometimes they can get challenging, they can be tough, there can be a lot of struggling back and forth on opinions, and I just got to say that this time, you know, we all agree we got to have a good health and welfare system, and we all kind of put our heads together about how we can improve the areas that needed it. So I really felt like it went well. I felt like the group was tremendous. Individuals, families, the board association, provider groups, other stakeholders, just an amazing group of people to help us out moving forward. And I guess I just open the floor to Jeff and Chuck for a minute just to give us your thoughts about the process and how things move forward.
Sure. This is Jeff. I guess I'll start with a question. Scott, did you include Chuck in that amazing group comment?
I did, but I don't think people were taking notes necessarily. Yeah.
So I think the point was, you know, a number of us, and Opera represents private providers in our system, and you know, over the years, as we engage and as we really experience this workforce challenge at the direct care level, you know, some of us have felt that there may be some unexpected consequences, unintended consequences of the current MUI system and all its, you know, all the pieces of the puzzle, and it can be hard on direct care in particular. And so we wanted to make sure that we were engaged in a conversation where it's not onerous, where not appropriate, right? And so we appreciated the fact of what Scott and Connie did in putting the work group together. You're right, we had a lot of diversity on the work group. It was, candidly, I've been around a long, long time. It was as good, you know, in that respect as possible, and getting that true discussion on how we can protect individuals and yet improve our system, right, where possible, and not drive people out of our system, particularly direct care, where we don't want to. And so I think we accomplished that in large measure, and we'll talk through that in some detail today as we go forward. So I think it was very proactive. My last comment on this, in this regard, is that, you know, we really applaud the department, Chuck and, or not Chuck, now, Scott and Connie, you know, because the national environment is a little bit different, right? I mean, we really see more and more pressure to ratchet more and more down and become on incidents. Right. And so, you know, we were able to really look at this comprehensively and see if we can't find that, you know, again, where absolute necessary, where there is abuse and neglect of serious nature, then you've got to deal with that immediately. Where there are situations that you can learn from, I think that's what we've tried to do, right? Absolutely. And improve the service delivery system in the process. So I will stop there. My kudos to all of you.
Appreciate it, Jeff.
Yeah, as far as with county boards, what I enjoyed about the process, not only was I able to communicate with other county boards and bring that to the table and those kind of things, but also just the communication amongst the folks on the committee, like parents, guardians, advocates, providers, and I really felt like that communication was something that people wanted to see in the rule. Like, we need to be able to communicate better, especially with guardians and family members who seem overwhelmed with the process at times. And also, I think providers were able to explain their concerns as far as when MUIs are filed or how they handle the situation of putting somebody on administrative leave and those kind of things. So I think what I got out of it, what we're trying to do with at our county board is with the preliminary findings, making sure that family members and guardians are part of that process when you need to, open communication lines better with family members and guardians about an MUI so they take that surprise out and assist them with that. I think the communication level where we mentioned in the team, now we've put guardian in as part of the team, which I think a lot of people already did, but making it part of the rule, it opens up communication. The preliminary findings, talking to family members opens up communication. The team members opens up communication, and then the UI process where you need to let people know at the home or at the agency when a UI happened at your facility to take that surprise out, so we don't get those calls where somebody's coming home with a mark and nobody knows how that occurred, because we just need to communicate better. So I think that's what I took out of the process, is that communication piece with a lot of different entities in our county.
And there's no doubt that was a big part of the stakeholder group discussion regarding individuals and families. Well, I appreciate it, guys. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and go through we've got the changes bullet pointed, and we'll try to move through these quickly. Obviously, if you have questions, you can feel free to write questions in there. We'll try to address those as we can. But really, the beginning part of the rule, we had the vision that the group took a look at. We wanted to focus on prevention, quality improvement, and certainly partnerships. And I think we've talked about how that happens and has to happen routinely if we're going to have a good health and welfare system. We also talked about the shift from the community and the person-centered plans. I mean, balance and quality of life and risk and health and welfare has never been probably more challenging than it is today. And, it's a good and a bad thing. I mean, it's good because we got people involved in more things that they've ever been involved in before. I mean, opportunities to enhance quality of life for folks is amazing. But whenever you have all those added opportunities, sometimes there's more risk that goes along with that, and the system has to think about that, and we have to think about how we protect people. We also take a look at the communication, as Chuck mentioned, and we'll talk about how we've addressed that. We looked at the administrative burden, and anytime you look at a rule in the 5-year rule review process, you should try to see how you can streamline and be more resource friendly, and so we've got some opportunities to make improvements there. We'll talk about that. And one of the other things I'm excited about is we're starting to spotlight more individuals, families, employees that are doing a really good job. I mean, sometimes it's really hard when the work is looking at MUIs all the time and some of the tough stuff that happens for individuals and families out there. But I guess what I'd tell you is every time we see those tough things happen, at the same time there's somebody in the family or somebody in a provider of service that steps up and really stands out. And we want to know when those kind of things happen. So I think a lot of you might have seen our most recent choking alert where we actually did an interview with a woman who has saved 5 people in her career from choking episodes. And to me, that's incredible and that's tremendous. And we all know that direct support professionals are the engine that drives this service delivery system. And when we can point out the great work that those folks do in combination with the things we've got to work on to improve, we need to do that. So if you guys have opportunities to share with the department, positive stories, uplifting stories, things where people have really helped folks move forward and be protected, we'd like to know about that. If you can send that in to Connie or myself. So we'll get through some of the bullets here. The first thing, very easy, the number changed. You guys know the rule used to be 5123-21702, and now it's 5123-1702. That 2 is not longer in there, and that's the way that the rules are being numbered now. The next bullet there talks about the actual MUI definition, and if you take a look at that definition, you're going to think it really doesn't seem that much different, and it truly isn't that much different. There were some words used in the existing language that talked about adversely affected and it talked about risk. And what we were informed of during the stakeholder process is all of our 19 MUI definitions really address that specific piece, that MUI piece in its own definition. So we didn't have to try to have one MUI definition that captured all those 19. So this is just a very general definition about what an MUI is, talks about the appendices that are available there. So not a real dramatic change in that actual MUI definition. The next thing here was to move the peer-to-peer acts to a category B or a protocol B investigation. And I think everybody probably knows that all MUIs are classified as either an A, B, or C based on the type of investigation that's required for that particular category. So the committee really felt like that peer-to-peer acts seemed to fall more on the lines of a category B investigation, and we agreed that that was probably true. Another change here is the definition of a DD employee, and you'll see this looks very familiar to the last definition with a couple changes. We've now included board members as identified as DD employees. So if you are a board member for a provider entity, if you're a board member for a county board, we're now identifying you as a person that's a DD employee and therefore would receive mandatory MUI Rule training and be identified as a mandatory reporter. And in fact, we did this training for the County Board Association a couple weeks ago and had several board members in the session that we had done, and I really got some positive feedback from them that they really appreciated this happening. Many of them had already were familiar, but thought that would be very good to have that in the rule moving forward. The next item here, and this is probably where the majority of the conversation for the stakeholder committee focused this last go-around, was about neglect. And I think many of you will know that our current existing definition is a very broad definition. It talks about when there's a duty, and it talks about that we fail to provide that duty, and there's really any kind of risk. That's really the current existing definition. So you can know that when there is that duty and when there is that risk, it's a neglect MUI. And I think that the committee members' comments really made some sense in that people felt like that's a real broad range to have an MUI for neglect with that very broad definition. And so what was recommended and what was discussed by everybody on the stakeholder committee was how could we make sure that we truly get to those neglect MUIs that we think that an investigative agent from a county board should be going out and doing that investigation, and not just have this really, really broad scope as it relates to that neglect definition. And if you take a look at the new definition, you can see there's been a couple changes. We talk about an individual with the medical care, personal care, or other support when there is that duty, and it results in a serious injury, so we've got a serious injury or outcome, or places that person or another person at risk of serious injury. So what we've done by virtue of this definition is really narrowed the focus of a neglect major unusual incident to be those serious and significant cases that really should be investigated by an investigative agent. And then as we talked about that, the stakeholder committee had a lot of concerns about, well, what about these other cases, these things that currently would be neglect under our current definition? How would we handle that if we streamline the definition for neglect to really focus on those more serious cases? And if you can go ahead and click 2 slides forward, Connie, we wanted to talk, what we decided to do is to go ahead and define an unusual incident, which we really hadn't done in the rule before, define a specific unusual incident that was going to capture those very cases that no longer would be classified as an MUI for investigation under neglect. So what that really means is that everything that's being reported today is still going to be reported today. What we've done is streamline the investigation process so that the more serious and significant neglect allegations will be MUIs and investigated by an IA. Those program implementation UIs are going to be reported, and those are going to be investigated by the provider of service. And we had really good feedback from the provider representatives on the stakeholder committee that said, I think this makes sense. I think the providers of service are ready and able and capable to do a good job of investigating these UI reports. And we really feel that moving forward, for this to be successful, that has to happen. And we, Connie and I have done some training for the department through the Office of Provider Standards and Review. We've done a lot of trainings regionally around the state already. And we're really getting a lot of positive feedback from providers and reviewers that they feel like this can be very successful. And it's only going to be as successful as we make it as a system, is if those providers can step up and do a really good job. Now, we all know that that investigation has to include cause and contributing factors. And in order to get those cause and contributing factors, once you get that prevention plan, that should address why something happened. I kind of liken it to doing just like a mini MUI investigation. You know, for those particular cases where there is, I'll give you an example. Let's say there's a person that hasn't been supervised for a period of time, let's say 10 minutes. There was no negative outcome. There was a potential risk, but it was a very general potential risk. That's one thing that may fall now into the program implementation UI category. The provider can get right on that, can look right into what happened, and make sure that it's not going to happen again and put a prevention plan in place for that UI, which makes sense. So basically, just to wrap this up, the neglect definition has been streamlined to not be near as broad as it is currently. We're still reporting everything that currently falls under the definition, but those things that no longer are going to be MUIs beginning the new year are going to be UIs. The providers of service are going to take a lot of ownership in and look into that. I don't know, Jeff, if you have any comments about that. I know we have a lot of discussion about that.
Yes, folks, on the phone can't hear me nodding my head to just about everything you said, Scott, but that's true. This was the large part of our discussion in some measure. It was the neglect definition, the reporting and the subsequent investigation that probably is centered provider concerns most around driving direct care staff out of our system. And so we felt this compromise. Nothing changes with respect to an action on the part, right, of a provider. Nothing. You still investigate in one way or another, but you take the whole system and involve it when you've got certainly harm involved, right, or significant risk of harm. So we're very appreciative on this. You're right about this is the culture change, I think, for both providers and investigative agents in particular, and how we look at this and how we work with it. But we hope that it has the kind of impact, positive impact we have.
Yeah, and I think we all agree it puts the focus back on prevention and the quality enhancement system. That's what the MUI system is all about. I wanted to take just a moment to address, we've had several people log in questions and comments that they're having difficulty hearing the audio, and so I apologize for that. It may be better to hop off and back on to the system if you're having difficulty. We do know that some of you are hearing an echo. We have more than 1,400 people logged onto the system at this point. The majority of people are not having difficulty hearing, so I apologize if you are having concerns on your end. But we'll go through the webcast, and hopefully the audio will pick back up for you.
And we wanted to talk about system neglect. I think a lot of you probably know what systems neglect is, and that's a situation where we've had a neglectful outcome. However, we can't say that one person is responsible. So it wasn't Chuck or Connie or Jeff or Scott. It was something that happened. The person did get neglected, but there were a lot of variables that played a role in that. And we didn't have this definition in the previous rule, but yet we've had some outcomes that are related to systems neglect. And as you guys can imagine, the outcome for a systems neglect case is, in terms of prevention, is much different than the outcome for a neglect that involves a person that either willfully or didn't even willfully do something. That usually means there's a system change within the provider entity, within the board entity, whatever the situation is, to improve and come up with that outcome. So systems neglect has been clearly defined now within this rule. Physical harm was also defined. It wasn't officially defined, and so for our physical abuse definition, you can see that we utilize physical harm there, and we've identified that as any injury, illness, or physiological impairment, regardless of its gravity or duration. Just wanted to kind of clarify what physical harm was for the physical abuse definition. And then for, outside of the neglect conversation, probably the other thing that we talked about within the stakeholder committee quite a bit was that peer-to-peer physical act definition. And right in front of you on the screen here, you have the current existing definition, and it's a longer definition. There was a lot of work and effort that went into this definition the last time the rule was revised. We were just trying to really cover those peer-to-peer physical acts very well. And even though I think there was a lot of thought and a lot of effort to think it through, it's still, as hard as we worked, I think it was still confusing. And we got a lot of questions, and people had some concerns about really understanding when a peer-to-peer physical act rose to the level of an MUI allegation. And because of that, there was a lot of feedback, a lot of give and take, a lot of discussion on the stakeholder committee. And we ended up coming up with a peer-to-peer physical act definition that really has 3 bullets. And it's these that we'll share here. If the injury results or the peer-to-peer act results in the examination or treatment by a physician, physician assistant, or nurse practitioner, or it involves strangulation or bloody nose, bloody lip, black eye, or a concussion. So we're talking about serious head and neck injuries as identified here in this bullet. Or if a person is bitten, which causes breaking of the skin, and we got some feedback through our group that that's a real serious and significant peer-to-peer issue. Or it results in an individual being arrested, incarcerated, or the subject of criminal charges. So that whole part in the previous definition about targeting, about firmly fixed, which I think for good reason we had tried to spell out the last time, it was just too confusing and hard to determine when do we really have a peer-to-peer act that requires an MUI investigation by a county board. So these 3 bullets, I think what I want to caution folks is on that first bullet, I want to caution you that what I want to make sure does not happen within the system is that people make a determination whether or not someone should be seen by the doctor based on whether or not it's an MUI or not. That shouldn't even come into your thought or mind for consideration. Do the way you normally do. If it looks like it, if the person fell, hit their head, it looked pretty hard, but you don't see a cut, but you think, man, that was a pretty hard hit, get the person checked out, get them looked into. Don't worry about whether it's an MUI or not an MUI. That really doesn't matter. We just want to make sure that people are clear as to what the peer-to-peer physical act definition is. And I think these 3 bullets capture the serious and significant peer-to-peer cases that we've seen across the state.
All right, moving on to Category B changes. You'll notice that the prone restraints, which are currently filed and investigated as physical abuse allegations, will now be filed as unapproved behavior supports. Everyone probably understands and realizes that prone restraints have been banned in the state of Ohio since 2009, and so we very strongly want to ensure that there is a thorough investigation every time a prone restraint is utilized, and we want to make sure that those are not happening in our state because they can be fatal. But instead of investigating those as physical abuse allegations as they are now, they will be investigated as unapproved behavioral supports. So that's a very minor change, but one we wanted to call out. In terms of the medical emergency definition, we wanted to add the use of an AED or a defibrillator because those are becoming more commonplace in the communities and facilities. And we also removed the use of IV for dehydration in this definition. What we were finding was that people were getting IVs used very routinely. It wasn't a life-saving measure, and so it no longer met that kind of life-saving measure that was called out in the medical emergency definition. And feel free to add anything, Scott or Chuck, if you have anything. Everything else in the medical emergency definition remains the same. So you'll see CPR, choking relief techniques, use of an EpiPen, all that remain the same. The only changes were the deletion of an IV and the adding of an AED. All right, moving on to law enforcement. Currently, we file law enforcement MUIs when an individual is charged, incarcerated, or arrested, and also when they have been tased. And but we had not added tased into the definition for a law enforcement MUI, and so that was just recently added and will be included in the revised rule, which will go in effect in January of 2019. Under unscheduled hospitalization, which will now be called unanticipated hospitalization, we wanted to add some clarification. What we see more frequently occurring is individuals are taken to the hospital and may remain there for several days without formally being admitted. And so we wanted to provide some clarification. And so in the unanticipated hospitalization definition, it says that if a person is in the hospital and they're admitted, that obviously meets the criteria, or if they're in the hospital and stay over 24 hours for something that is not pre-scheduled or planned, or something that is not associated with a planned treatment in their service plan, that would be considered an unanticipated hospitalization. And it was just to clarify this, so if you're admitted or you're in the hospital for over 24 hours and it's not pre-scheduled, or if it's not something that's specifically called out in your service plan as being kind of a routine chronic medical condition that you have, then those will be filed and investigated as unanticipated hospitalizations. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on here to unapproved behavior supports, which will now be called unapproved behavioral supports. Again, we did some language change here by changing the definition term and also cleaning up the rule reference, and also including prone restraints in those investigations. We talked a lot in the stakeholder group about increasing communication, and I know Chuck and Jeff were a large part of those conversations, just about how we can not only enhance the quality system that we have for reporting and investigating, but making sure that everyone is informed along the way. And so one of the provisions that we added in the rule was that anytime there's an MUI, that the incident provider will let other providers of service, as necessary, know about that MUI to ensure continuity of care and support for the individual. So again, this is C of the provision that we're talking about, and really it's just to take the surprise out. So if Chuck falls at home and he goes to the day program should be aware that he's fallen, so they can be aware and also look for anything that they can do to better support him in whatever setting he's in. The rule used to previously talk about incidents that occurred at a county board operated program, that program would notify, the residential program or the family of any MUIs. And so we thought we wanted to further clarify to say it's not just the day program, it's any provider of service that can better support that person, that they should be communicated when there's an MUI. So that's what we added here, again, just to increase that communication, keep everybody in the loop. The other thing that we added to the rule is when there's a sexual or a physical abuse allegation that is not being conducted by law enforcement or a children's service board, the county board will endeavor to reach a preliminary finding within 14 days of investigation or initiating that investigation. So for those two very serious MUI allegations, physical and sexual abuse, the county board will try within 14 days to come up with a finding, and they'll communicate those findings to the individual, their guardian, and the provider. And again, they may not have a finding, but at least they can let people know within 14 working days what the status of that investigation is. This will help, I think, when staff have been removed, if a direct support person has been removed from direct contact, that keeping the people in the loop about what is going on. If there's additional allegations that come up through the course of the investigation, it's possible that a finding may not be available at that time. But again, this is about, opening up those lines of communication, making sure that everyone is well aware of what's going on, and trying to be as timely as possible when it comes to those more serious allegations. Chuck or Jeff, do you guys have anything you want to add to that? Or
I think I really like this part, because I think with the communication we had, with Jeff, and he brought it up earlier, we have some really good staff out there that are working hard. They are the backbone of what we're trying to do and accomplish for the individuals we serve. And there will be an MUI, and for somebody with the pay that they get and the work they do to be off work without pay for 10, 15, 20 days, sometimes we lose staff. They're just like, it's not worth it. I'll do something else for a living, or we're losing some really good people. So I think that communication, we would have an MUI, trying to get people back to work as quick as possible, and ensuring health and safety at the same time. And I think that can be accomplished as long as the provider and the county board and everyone involved is working together. So I think this is a really good piece.
I think some family members and individuals had some comments about this too, where they had mentioned, we know when something usually is kicked off, we know that something's happened, and we know we have a good system in Ohio, but sometimes things will go on for a long period of time. We don't know what happened. Nobody's communicated with us. This kind of language, this kind of follow-up will help drive communication to make sure people know what's going on, both providers, families, and guardians.
okay. So again, that's for physical or sexual abuse when law enforcement or CFB is not the lead. The county board will endeavor to come up with a preliminary finding within 14 days and communicate that to the individual, their guardian, and the provider. The other thing that we talked about in terms of increasing communication is just making sure that within agencies, senior management know what's going on in terms of serious allegations. And this also kind of aligns with the Office of the Inspector General and some of their best practice recommendations. And so we've added a provision in the rule where senior management for agency providers, whether that be county board or private agencies, will be informed within 2 working days of serious allegations, including misappropriation, neglect, physical abuse, or sexual abuse. And so we've had a lot of people ask us, as we've done these trainings, who in their agency would be the senior management person that we're referring to. And really, it's up to the agency themselves to come up with a written procedure or add to an existing procedure who that person is. It could be by title, it could be by name, but it should be clearly spelled out in your policies and procedure who in your agency qualifies as that senior management person that should be notified of, you know, an incident of misappropriation, neglect, physical abuse, or sexual abuse. And the reason for that is we believe that the senior management person that you've identified is going to be the one that can take action and make sure that protections are put in place, that if there's things that need to happen, that those things are being assured. And so we want to make sure that your agency has addressed that through your policies and procedures, and that your staff are trained on who they should be notifying in these incidences. We've also been asked, you know, once you've identified those people in policy and procedure, are there specific things that when the Office of Provider Standards and Review go out to look at our policies and procedures they're looking for? And we really believe that senior management person or position should be someone with authority, with a certain amount of authority. So it's not going to be your home manager, your shift supervisor. It's going to be someone like a director position, someone that could take some administrative action. So hopefully that makes sense.
I wanted to just add too, we had some good feedback when we did the face-to-face trainings here where someone said, you know, that they love the new communication and they thought this could be readily captured maybe on the UI log, to have a spot on the log that, or on the UI itself that says, we notified senior management, we got that documented, we notified the other provider of service because of this happened on the UI, and that's a great way to have it all captured right there. And again, it just helps us to drive that improved communication with everybody within the field.
And I should have mentioned that when the Office of Provider Standards and Review comes out to look at policies and procedures, there's going to be a 3-month grace period on all the new MUI rule requirements. So, you know, we understand that it's going to take some time to get policies and procedures revised and also staff trained on the senior management notification. So just so you're aware, that's what we're looking at. After April 1st, these new rule requirements will be reviewed by the Office of Provider Standards and Review, and prior to that, it will be just technical assistance provided. The other thing we looked at and spent some time talking about was the unusual incident definition. And so most of this definition, up until the very end, has really not changed. You'll notice that same things that we had in before: medication errors without a likely risk of harm, peer-to-peer acts that didn't rise to the level of an MUI, those are still considered unusual incidents. However, we did make some changes at the very end of the definition. You'll see here where we've added emergency room or urgent care treatment center visits, and also the program implementation incidents that Scott talked about earlier. So we thought it was important to specifically call out these additions here. Part of the reason we wanted to include emergency room or urgent care treatment center visits was, again, because it was a best practice by the Office of the Inspector General, but even more so, it goes to talking about how can we ensure that the individuals that we support are getting needed follow-up when they go get emergency room treatment. So a lot of times people go to the ER and they may be prescribed an antibiotic, or there's some follow-up with their primary care physician, and sometimes we see that doesn't happen, and that person ends up in the hospital or back in the ER. And so by virtue of writing an unusual incident report, we hope that there'll be documented follow-up and ensure that everything that needs to happen to better support that person in their health happens, so that we can prevent future ER visits and hopefully also prevent hospitalizations that don't need to occur. And then lastly, again, the program implementation incidents, those are going to be things that today may be filed as MUIs for neglect, and moving forward may meet that program implementation UI criteria, and so those are going to be investigated by the provider of service. So everything that's called out in this UI definition are things that we would expect to see a provider complete unusual incident investigation for.
Yeah, and I would just add on there that the additions by the urgent care treatment center visits and the program implementation incidents are the main additions. And again, the expectation is good quality UI investigations by providers. And people will be looking for that. Folks in their regulatory review process will be looking for those UIs to be done well. We as a department will be offering resources, and there's some resources already available on our web page to help you with UI investigations. We already feel like some are done very, very well already. We just want to make sure we call out these additions and make sure that those get your attention. And we work really hard to do good quality outcome investigations on those UIs.
Okay, another topic that we spent some time on in our stakeholder group was talking about the removal of direct care physicians or the removal of employees when there's a serious allegation. Our current rule talks about removing any person from direct contact with any at-risk individual when the employee is alleged to be involved in abuse or neglect. So that's our current MUI rule. Until the provider has been reasonably determined that such removal is no longer necessary. We've made some revisions to this part of the rule, and we've removed neglect. And we specifically called out physical abuse and sexual abuse here. So the revised rule will now say that removal of an employee from a direct contact with any individual, so no longer at-risk individual, any individual when the employee is alleged to have been involved in physical abuse or sexual abuse until such time as the provider has reasonably been determined that removal is no longer necessary. And we underlined the word provider here because we wanted to emphasize this. It is the provider's responsibility to determine, hopefully in partnership with the county board that is doing the investigation, at which point a person may be returned back to work. And so we think it's important to say that, you know, a county board can recommend that an employee remain off shift throughout the investigation or to a different point in the investigation, but really it's the provider who makes that determination. So let's say there's a physical or a sexual abuse allegation, immediately that person is going to be removed from direct contact. That's just a part of the rule. That's in there. But at the point that the provider believes that that person can be returned to work or removal is no longer necessary, then that person can come back to work. We removed neglect from this part of the rule because, again, our neglect definition was so broad, but oftentimes we were seeing that sometimes other immediate or appropriate immediate actions weren't being taken. So it seems to us like a lot of times people were just being put on leave regardless of what the allegation was, regardless of the severity, whether there was injury, you know, or other things like that. And so we really would encourage people to look at what the allegation is and see what makes the most sense for the individual that's being supported or any other individuals, what makes sense for the agency and the employee. So if someone self-reports, you know, I didn't put someone's safety belt on them in their wheelchair, but they were at significant risk because maybe they can't hold their upper body up, that's going to be reported right away, but maybe the staff person can be retrained immediately. So there are other immediate actions that can occur other than removing a staff from shift when it comes to neglect and some of these other allegations. So again, just to emphasize, a person should be removed from direct contact when there's a sexual or physical abuse allegation. And then at the point that the provider can reasonably determine that they can be, removal is no longer necessary, they can be returned. It is required that the provider notify the county board when those protective actions have been changed. So if Chuck is returning someone back to work, and that was part of the immediate actions to remove them, he needs to notify that county board and they can have a conversation about that. If the county board and the provider don't agree that, that's keeping people safe or providing enough protections, then the department can be consulted about that. Again, we've removed the neglect part from this provision of the rule. The other thing that people have raised, and I think is a valid concern, is there may be other allegations that are very serious that aren't listed here in rule, and there's nothing that precludes an employer from removing an employee. So if there's a serious allegation of misappropriation with Jeff, and his agency employer says you're going to be placed on leave pending the investigation, then obviously they're able to do that as his employer. So hopefully that makes sense. Did you want to add anything, Scott?
No, I think you guys are.
Okay. The other things we talked about were trying to eliminate multiple filings if that's possible. And this has to do more from an administrative standpoint in terms of the county boards, how many things are being filed for individuals that may be event-based. We removed the semi-annual analysis requirement for both the county board and the provider. We still think looking at patterns and trends by provider, by individual, by agency, house, home, whatever program is important, but we want to focus on the annual reporting requirement to do the analysis. So again, that semi-annual analysis has been removed. And then we also provided some clarification in the rule about written notifications to the PPIs, that would only include DD employees, guardians, and families, and not community members. We're going to talk a little bit, hopefully, about falls and choking prevention, but because we've seen a real trend in our state for those incidents and those significant injuries and sometimes deaths, we've added some guidance in the protocols for investigators when they are investigating allegations or MUIs that have to do with choking or falls. The other thing, in line with the medical emergencies for choking, we have decided that the department will review and close all medical emergency MUIs. The other thing that we've clarified is that the county board will now have till 5 p.m. to enter MUIs into the system. Currently, they have until 3 p.m. We also tried to clarify in the rule that unusual incidents reports require both a name and a signature. I think before it said name or signature, and sometimes it was difficult to read that, so we wanted to provide some clarity there. We spent a little bit of time talking about unusual incidents and what the different types of unusual incidents are. Those things defined in that definition are going to be the things that we expect to see investigations for by the provider, and also on the unusual incident logs. We also added things like adding cause contributing factors to the UI logs that have to be reviewed monthly for patterns and trends. But we wanted to be specific that things like program implementation, ER visits, urgent care visits, peer-to-peer incidents that don't rise to the level of an MUI, that those things and only those things defined as UIs in the rule are contained on a provider's UI logs. So hopefully that makes sense. Scott's going to talk a little bit about the implementation considerations, things that as providers you should look at and make changes for with the coming rule changes.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. So talking about implementation, and this will be a little bit of a repeat of some of the things, but obviously training is going to be key. And we need to start, as I mentioned earlier, we've done 5 regional face-to-face trainings. We're doing this webinar today. We're going to continue to provide training, and we'd like you guys to go ahead and continue to get training started and get rolling for the new year, because as Connie had mentioned, this will be kicked off for 2019. And so we want to make sure that we do our best job and maximizing the ability to train people in a number of different arenas. The second section there talks about the different areas where changes have been made. So when you're looking at your policies and procedures, looking at what you need to revise, you can take a look at some of these things to guide you on where to go to make those changes. We talked about the MUI rule training for board members. Most people, like I said, were doing that. If you weren't, make sure that you think about that in the coming year to get that lined up We also talked about supervisors having the training they need to make sure that those UI investigations are done well. I think we've hit that several times, so you know how important that's going to be moving forward. Making sure that you utilize social media in any way that you can to get information out to your staff and stakeholders. And then obviously some changes to the actual form of the incident report, along with some additional website updates. And we'll be having some updates on all of our systems here in DODD as well to make sure we make the changes that are appropriate. We talked about the senior management notification clearly, and that can be captured on the UI form. We think that's a good way to do that. And then obviously the term changes and the rule number changes is some of the additional implementation considerations. We hit UI logs, I think, pretty good. This is just a recap of all the detail and the expectation of good UI investigations for these pieces that are going to be held on the log. And then just a real quick recap. We're doing this webinar training today that's going to be taped and posted. We've got a live chat coming up on January 23rd. And many of you know we have two tools that we utilize here through the department. Frequently asked questions as it relates to different questions people present on the rule, as well as interpretive guidelines to try to give us some detail and some examples of what we're looking at with the definition changes. So we'll be updating our tools, both of those tools, and those will be available on the website for people to utilize for training, both for agency and independent providers, as well as forms that we make updates and additions to. All right, so that's kind of the recap of the rule. Before we finish up here, because I know we've got about 10, 12 minutes left, I wanted to talk a little bit about some emerging trends or some things that we've seen through the department through our data analysis and make sure that you all are familiar. Many of you, if you've heard me speak before, or Connie, we're real passionate about choking and trying to improve outcomes as it relates to choking in Ohio. And this is a chart that goes back to 2006. That shows you the number of medical emergencies, the number of life-saving interventions, and then the number of choking deaths that we've had in Ohio. And I think it's important to take a look at the kind of the progression from 2006 to current, and you can see that back in 2006, we had 18 deaths in Ohio. And if you look current year to date for us in 2018, we're at 19 deaths, and we're not at the end of the year yet. So, you know, it's something that we need to really pay attention to. And there are a few of these deaths that are simply accidents. Someone doesn't have a diet texture or doesn't have a supervision, and that happens. That happens with the general population. But there are also some that are included in here where someone had a special diet texture or someone had a supervision level that maybe wasn't met, and there were some concerns about that, and that's being a contributing factor to some of these cases. So I know we've got a good group of people on the calls today. If you can please do everything you can where you work to make sure that choking prevention and choking awareness is of the highest priority. I think here's some great things to remember. If somebody's having some coughing during meals or during snack time, or just you're not comfortable, get that assessment, get that evaluation done to try to make sure, is that person aspirating? Are they having trouble swallowing? Get the team involved. We've got a lot of people that have been seen or on really good changed diet textures that are going to help keep them healthy and well. But I think what's really even more important than that is making sure that when that diet texture is identified, that we do a really good job of training our direct support professionals on how to prepare that diet texture, what that supervision level is during the meal, so that individuals have the supports they need when that happens. Because there's a lot of situations where people pass away related to choking incidents, and some of those cases, if you look at the data and the investigation, are preventable. There's no question. And so we got to do a good job as a field of identifying that, raising the awareness, and making sure that people have a great understanding of the folks they support, how they can prepare the textures, how they can supervise folks during meals to make sure that we help prevent as many of these cases as we can. In addition to choking, falls prevention is critical. And you can see from this chart that about half of all of our significant injuries that are reported in Ohio are related to falls. Going back to 2010, you see we've got anywhere from 750 to, we've actually shown some improvement last year in 17, not quite 700. But at the same time, you guys know significant injuries definition, that's when you've got a broken bone, you've got a laceration, you've got a significant injury, and you can see that half of those coming in are from falls. And unfortunately, we've had some people fall and hit their head. And I think the next slide probably shows that we've had some people that had passed away from fall issues. And last year we had 9 people pass away from fall related deaths. So really, really important. Choking and falls, make those things a hot topic at all your staff meetings. Make sure the service planning meetings address this. If there's a risk identified for someone, I mean, we can't hit these two items enough, folks, to make sure that we try to really work hard and protect the very vulnerable population that we support as it relates to these two things. And then kind of the final thing I wanted to talk about is we've seen a little bit of an increase here in transportation-related MUIs. So think about this in where you work and talk to your folks about this, because some very simple things. People forgetting to secure the wheelchair in the van or in the bus, and you make a turn and someone tips over and hits their head. Forgetting to secure the person in the wheelchair, even though the chair itself is secure. So you hit the brakes and the person becomes a projectile that falls out of their chair. Having a situation where people are dropped off at their home and there's no support staff there. Issues with lifts and people not assuring that the lift is in place. We've had some accidents and some people get hurt pretty bad with pushing someone out onto a lift and either the lift not being completely up or just not care being taken and the person being pushed off of the lift. We've had people left in vehicles in situations where somebody's run the route to take people to work or home and then forgot to check to make sure everybody was off of the van or the bus, and people have been left unattended in hot weather and cold weather. So a lot of these things, you think about it and you think, the cause or contributing factor to some of these kind of incidents is people just kind of getting in a hurry and trying to, I know that we're in a rush and I know there's a lot of work to do, but we've got to always keep in mind that, the health and welfare of others is in our hands when we're doing that kind of work, and to make sure that meals are safe, to make sure that people are getting from point A to point B in a way that makes sense. To make sure that people are assisted in and out of their homes and up and down steps, so that they don't fall. Just a lot of these kind of things. And we want to make sure that because we have data and through our MUI unit, we have some really rich data. We get good information on what's happening with the folks that we support throughout the state. So we can come and share this information with you so you can take it back to your place of business and make sure that these kind of things aren't happening where you work, because it's troubling. And a lot of these cases are very, very preventable. And we've got to work really hard to get out in front of this kind of stuff. So that kind of is a recap of some of the emerging trends and some of the things we wanted to talk to you about. We've gotten through the rule changes. We've gotten through some of the implementation pieces. We talked to you about the start date of January of 19 and the 3-month ability to kind of get people trained and get things together, and we'll be providing technical assistance during that time. I do know that, Connie, we've had some questions kind of come through as we've been talking, and we may have some time to hit a few of those. If you want to try to get a few of those, I think we got about 10 minutes left. We can capture that. Guys, have anything else you want to add?
No, the last piece is really important. In our county, we've seen a huge increase with transportation concerns. And I just don't think you can train folks enough. I think, back in the day, I was a bus aide 100 years ago, and that was one of the toughest jobs I ever had. And I still see people that get trained maybe an hour or two, and they show them how to use the straps. And then I don't know how often anybody comes back and retrains and that kind of stuff. And sometimes that's, you're in a rush and those kind of things. But also, it's just not a natural thing. Not all of us have done those kind of things in the past. So to learn that new skill, and it's so important because our folks are at such a risk, when they're just in a wheelchair trying to go from point A to point B, and we have people tipping over all the time, and they're at risk.
And I think something else I forgot to mention is the slide that's up in front of you there, the issue of texting and driving and being under the influence and, things that we just got to really work really, really hard, because not only are you responsible for yourself, but you're responsible for other people when that's going on. So.
All right. Well, thanks, Chuck. One of the questions we had was about electronic signatures. More and more are using electronic systems. Is it okay to have that?
Yeah, obviously we want to try to be as user-friendly as we can, and certainly electronic signatures are fine.
Okay. Some questions around program implementation, obviously, because that's new, and wanted to know if this is a new MUI category. So that's the first question. And secondly, if you could provide some examples.
Yeah, so back to the slide, it's a program implementation UI. So when we talk about that, we're talking about unusual incidents. So it's another unusual incident along with those dental injuries and those peer-to-peers that don't rise to the level of an MUI. It's a situation that the provider investigates and the provider is looking into. So it's a really good question. And remember, program implementation was what we captured to to get those particular incidents that today might be in the neglect definition, but that the stakeholder committee and our group thought could be addressed by the provider of service through a UI investigation.
So some examples might be if someone gets in a car accident and they're cited, but there's no injury, there's little to no risk, that would be considered a program implementation UI, unusual instance, whereas today that might be filed as an MUI for neglect. Any other examples anyone wants to provide?
Not for sure, but you may look at if somebody's a 2-on-1 and one of the staff gets there 10 minutes late. So for 10 minutes, I was a 1-to-1 instead of a 2-on-1. Depends on the risk, what's in the ISP, right, that kind of stuff. So I think, you're going to look at those kind of things.
Great. We've had people ask, how quickly will this webcast be posted to our website, and where will it be posted? So the question is, look for it early next week, and it will be in our training library, and you'll be able to find it there. Some people have also asked if they can get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. If you go to the webinar system, you'll see there's 2 handouts that are attached there. You can download them now. One is the handouts from today's presentation. The second is the group attendance. We've also emailed this out to people that registered as of yesterday evening, so it's available there. We can also send that out later as well. There are probably at least 50 questions that have been posted, so we will not get a chance to go through each of those. We will type those out and address those and send them out to everyone that participated in today's webcast so that you have those answers there. We've had some questions around unusual incidents and what constitutes a pattern or trend. So if I'm doing my UI log reviews on a monthly basis, Chuck, what would constitute a pattern or trend for someone?
I think you can make that decision on your own depending upon the person. We've always just kind of trained in the past 3 a week, 5 in a month, same or similar. So when you're doing that log review, but if you see 2 serious issues, you don't have to go, that's not in the rule anywhere. Do what you think is best for that individual. But 3 in a week, 5 in a month is what I would expect from a provider to address when I'm looking at logs.
Great. Another question was, are there any MUI or UI reports changing? And so I'm not sure I completely understand, but we do, there's still 19 categories of MUIs. We did have some definition changes. We had 2 just term changes in terms of the unanticipated hospitalization, unapproved behavioral supports, and we added some things to the UI or unusual incident definition. In terms of the actual incident reports themselves, we will have changes to add senior management notification and also to change the signature and name of person completing the form.
I think we were going to add A and B stuff as well, because it did, the slide mentioned about appendix A and B. Changing in regards to significant injury and medical emergency, how to investigate those. So maybe that's.
Okay, yeah, so there are some changes, and hopefully those were outlined, the significant ones, throughout the PowerPoint. But if not, certainly feel free to contact our office at any time. We'd be happy to walk through those changes.
Is the rule in appendix A, B, and C on the website?
Correct. So if you go to the website, to DODD's website, under rules, under development, you will find a copy of the MUI rule that was filed on November 20th, and the appendices A, B, and C attached there, and so you can download a copy. In terms, there were some questions about hospitalizations. So one of the questions was, what if someone goes to the hospital and they're just there for 3 or 4 hours? Does that mean that should be filed as an unanticipated hospitalization?
Yeah, and remember we talked about an admission. So whenever the person is admitted, or if they've been there over 24 hours. So you would have your UI probably if someone goes in and is seen for a short period of time and is released, just like you would your urgent care or your other information.
Okay, and this is probably something that I should clarify, because I spoke about county boards having until 5 p.m. To enter something into the incident tracking system. The requirement for providers, whether that be independent providers, agency, or ICF, there is no change. They're still required to submit the incident report to the county board by 3 p.m. the next working day following their discovery of an MUI. So the requirement for providers to send that into the county board by 3 p.m. Has not changed. What has changed is the county board has 2 additional hours to enter those reports into the incident tracking system. So thanks for that question and making sure that's clear to all. We had another person ask, we talked about January start date, right, Scott? So they said we're having a training, you know, in the early part of January. Should we train all our staff on the new rule and the changes?
Yeah, and I think for, if it's going to be in January, the new rule will be in place by then. You know, the training can include, I think a lot of what we're going to do is kind of what we've done today is let people know that there's been a rule change. Here's the previous, here's the new rule. That's kind of a good way to make sure everybody knows what the changes are. And then the remainder of the rule hasn't changed at all. And again, as we mentioned, you know, there wasn't that many changes. There's a couple different definitions. There's a few term changes. And I think we forgot to mention this. In terms of the changes for a direct support professional, there really is very limited changes in this rule for the direct support professional. A lot of what we're talking about has to do with the administration of the health and welfare system, which would be your managers and your administration and the boards. So really, the reporting process for DSPs, direct support professionals, is remaining pretty much the same.
Great. It is past 3 o'clock now, and we recognize that we have not addressed all the questions and comments that have come in, but we will do so via email at a later point and send those to everyone that participated today. Just a quick reminder, this will be posted on our website, and within, I'd say, early next week, and with that taped recording, we will also have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation available for you there in the training catalog, and we will send out some correspondence with the questions that have been asked. Trying to think, Scott, any additional or closing things you would like to?
No, I want to thank everybody for your attention today, and I want to just reiterate that I feel like we have a tremendous critical incident reporting system, health and welfare system in Ohio. I want to thank the stakeholder group for all their time and effort and attention to help us try to improve this this time around, and I think there's been some excellent changes to help us improve the system for providers, for families, for individuals, for the department, for everybody. And so thank you so much for the work that you do. I really appreciate it. Obviously, as whenever a new rule happens, transition issues will come up, questions will come up. Please feel free to contact your local county boards, providers of service. Please feel free to contact them. Boards, please feel free to contact us. We'll all work together to try to make sure that, you know, any of these changes, where there's questions, that we are consistent in the outcomes associated with them. But thanks again for all your work. Very much appreciate all that you do. And Jeff, Chuck, anything else you'd like to say?
No, it's great.
No, thanks for everything you do.
All right.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.